Welcome back to the Dot Citizen podcast. Today we are here with Shannon McGregor. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. Shannon McGregor is an associate professor in communications at the University of Utah, and her research aims to bring insights about and new theories of emerging communications in media and political systems. So, Shannon, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and just really to start out, big picture, if you could just tell us a little bit, let's just hear your elevator pitch. Tell us a little bit about your work and the focus of your research.
Yeah, so I guess the focus of my research for the last couple of years has mostly been on what I consider like the production of politics and the role that social media plays in that. So how different groups of, in particular, elite actors, so campaigns, candidates, journalists, and what role social media plays in how they create politics and, from the journalist perspective, cover politics.
Before we dig into the past couple of years, we wanted to get some context on what was happening before the 2016 election online with politics and social media platforms. So we know now that there were foreign actors amplifying divisive topics online long before the election. And in the election, they just happened to strike gold. But in 2014 and 2015, the major public controversy online was Gamergate. So it was a movement that was ostensibly, said with air quotes, about ethics in game journalism, but started with a domestic violence and violence against women situation. So as Gamergate developed, one thing that I reported on at the time was that extremist groups were using the movement to recruit. And I'd love your perspective on Gamergate today and how it has echoed through our politics and what it kind of taught us about how social media platforms are used in our politics today.
I think it taught us that social media can be used to treat women horribly, and I don't think that has changed, unfortunately, too much.
No, it has not, sadly, but I agree.
You know, and we've seen some of the ripples of this and, things like in the wake of the Me Too movement, like the shitty men in media list that circulated between women journalists in particular on social media. And then, in turn, having some of those women journalists sort of being everything from like one end maybe being simply harassed on Twitter to being doxxed and having their personal information offline being shared online to where other people could reach them. But I think that the veil of anonymity, and I think that we saw this with Gamergate, the sort of veil of anonymity that social media offers folks, even when it does have your real name and your real picture next to it, you're not looking at someone, there is this sort of bit of anonymity, allows folks to treat one another maybe worse or differently than they would otherwise. And I think, obviously we saw that with Gamergate, and how that plays out in politics is similarly, right? This is pre-2016 election, but I did a couple studies back when I was a grad student at Texas looking at how women politicians presented themselves on social media and then also how they were sort of treated on social media as well. And one of the findings that we did this like big network analysis of how much of like the share of candidates' voices, male versus female candidates, were taking up. And at first we saw that male voices, so male candidates, were able to like say more. So they were being like less people were talking about them. It was more their words. So like, oh, that's interesting. And then we created this sort of variable called like a reply ratio. And for female candidates, the reply ratio was humongous as compared to male candidates. And at first we thought, well, maybe people are just talking about them and they're really engaged. And then we thought, oh, that's a really optimistic view of it, right? And if we dive into those replies, what we see is mostly, amplified online, this idea that men can talk at women more than they can, more than they might to other men. And so I think we see those same dynamics to different extents, play out in politics as well, and Gamergate was sort of the height of it. And I think brought it to people's attention, and that spilled over into politics of being something that people are aware of from like the political campaign strategy. This is something now that we need to think about.
That's incredible. I think we should really probably have kind of a Gamergate Me Too thing be sort of its own section at some point.
I mean, the last time I reported on Gamergate, my face ended up on the Daily Stormer.
Oh,
so,
that's fun.
So, yeah, maybe it's just I need time to deal with the harassment.
Totally.
So.
Yeah.
Sad that I have to plan for that.
I know.
Well, to pull it back into sort of things that are a little bit more recent, one of the things we wanted to talk about today would be kind of looking at the 2018 election that's coming up, as well as the 2020 election and onward. But let's take a look at the 2016 election. And so you recently co-authored a piece titled "Technology Firms Shape Political Communication: The Work of Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, and Google with Campaigns During the U.S. Presidential Cycle." So to start off, could you just tell us some of the big picture findings here and how that might relate to what we're going to see moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a study that I did with my co-author, Daniel Kreese at UNC Chapel Hill, and we interviewed a bunch of people who worked in digital and tech on the 2016 campaigns, the presidential campaigns, both primary and general election presidential campaigns. And what we found was that people from these companies, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, were much more involved with political campaigns than certainly we had previously known, and that it seemed like political science and communication science had accounted for. So we found that there were that these firms had developed like partisan teams, mirroring sort of the digital consultancies. So there are teams of Republicans in Facebook who work with Republican campaigns and teams of Democrats who work with Democratic campaigns, that it has sort of mirrored the political structure or the structure of politics. And we found that they were really working as like quasi-digital consultants up to being embedded, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here too, with the Trump campaign during the 2016 general election. When we talked to representatives, people who worked in the political divisions of these different firms, we found they did it for a couple of reasons. First is, of course, money, right?
Yeah.
Over $1 billion, was spent on the 2016 presidential campaign, and a lot of that went to digital advertising buys. So, of course, they do this to facilitate more advertising buys. But we also find it that they engage in the space to seek sort of political legitimacy, to be a part of politics, and ultimately to further lobbying efforts. I mean, the candidates that they help support during any campaign are ultimately going to be in a place to regulate them or not. And so, it goes towards that idea of relationship building as well.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting outcomes of this research is that actually just last week, Facebook announced that they will no longer be having these quote unquote embeds in political campaigns. When we had talked to people about it, one of our arguments was that these firms like Facebook and Twitter and Google had rather simplistically imported these commercial models. They're like, yeah, well, of course we do this for anyone who spends a lot of money. But like, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump aren't like Pepsi and Coke, right? Like politics are different. And so they'd imported these commercial models without really thinking about the political impact of that. So Facebook announced last week that they'll no longer be embedding people within political campaigns, which I think is a good thing. So
Yeah.
I think, I'd agree with that as well. But I also wonder if we can really trust necessarily that that's going to be happening. And maybe we can get back to that later. But actually, before doing that, one thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned there was this idea of tech firms being embedded in campaigns as a means to try to, build relationships for things like lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing I wanted to ask about was, for example, in the political science literature, for people who are listening that might not be aware of this, there's kind of been a recent trend of people talking about lobbying not necessarily as this bad thing where they're buying politicians and stuff like that, but they see it rather as a sort of legislative subsidy. And basically, instead of changing the minds of politicians, politicians are getting access to basically staff and information that they wouldn't necessarily have. And I think there's probably some truth to that. And so I'm curious to see, because on one hand, I think you could see some of these embeds as a subsidy in a way for, creating campaigns in a better way and like crafting messages better. But it also doesn't, like you said, Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're not, the campaigns they're working with are not like Coke or Pepsi. So what's essentially different about them? Like, why could something like tech firm employees being embedded in these companies really be a danger in a democratic sense?
So the real world implications are different. I mean, even if we take just the case of the 2016 election as an example, Google and Facebook and Twitter offered these sort of in-house services to both the Donald Trump campaign and the Hillary Clinton campaign, but only the Donald Trump campaign said yes, right? It was just the facts of what was going on the ground. The Clinton campaign had this deep background of folks working in tech who came out of like Dean and Obama, and they were like, yeah, no, we're good, right? Like, we don't need this. We're good. And the Trump campaign, if we remember, especially when he was going into the general election, had almost no campaign infrastructure. So they were eager to jump at this. Now, can we say that the outcome election turned on this help? No, we can't say that. But we can't say it didn't, on the other hand, either, right? Yeah. We don't know the role of this. And so we see the real world implications of these things, playing out differently just based on, individual campaigns, wanting to participate in this or not, or needing to participate in this or not. And even when we saw the sort of level of folks working from these different tech firms with the campaigns, even when they were not embedded, they're not just advising on things like advertising buys. They're sharing data and insights that they have access to, through their various platforms to say things like, well, people, for example, Google said to Jeb Bush's campaign, well, people are really searching about how tall you are, and you're tall. So you should probably create some card that might come up during the debate when people are searching for you that will show your height in relation to like the other candidates and maybe like football players and basketball players, right? So taking this insight that people in the Bush campaign in this case wouldn't necessarily have had access to, search data about, their candidate generally, and being able to use that to create organic and also paid posts as well. I also wanted to talk for a second about this idea of the subsidy that you mentioned as well. I absolutely, we agree. This seems like a subsidy, and almost an in-kind donation.
Right.
I am not a campaign finance expert, so I don't feel like I'm in a position to say whether or not this is a FEC violation, but I could see where that argument could potentially be made.
For sure.
The consulting, that's a lot of money, and these campaigns are basically getting it not for free, but it's an in-kind donation of these staffers' times, whether they're embedded or not, to facilitate different campaigns.
So you mentioned that Facebook has said that they are going to be, I read that they were going to be cutting down on it, not completely stopping. So do you know if they're completely stopping if they're hedging there?
I read that they were not going to have people embedded in the campaigns anymore, that they'll, I'm sure, still be working, pretty closely with campaigns, but they really wanted to guide them through some like web portal or something. But that's what I read, is that they weren't going to have people embedded, dedicated solely, in-house to particular campaigns.
And I mean, I think the reason that I even have to ask that question is because there has been so much that's happened with Facebook there that we've learned that they did during the election, and they haven't been very transparent about it. And so there's been a lot of public trust in Facebook that has been lost. And so I guess my question is, are social media, not just Facebook, but are social media and tech firms becoming more responsible in these aspects and kind of realizing that, their work has real world impact beyond just what somebody puts online? And in what areas do they still remain deficient in addressing some of these issues? It's a tough question.
No, I'm just thinking about it. Yeah. I think they're trying. I do think they're trying. We have seen efforts like Facebook and Google both now have political ad repositories that they've posted that anyone can access, and you can see what political ads were targeted to you or to people like you or to people not like you, right? And can sort of see what's going on. And I don't want to downplay that. I think that is an important step toward transparency. However, as I would argue, the attention that Daniel Crease's paper and I got is testimony to the fact that people were not aware of these working relationships between political campaigns and these tech firms. So I think we certainly need a lot more transparency around the processes, not just the ads themselves. For example, there's been a lot of talk recently that firms like Facebook and Google and Twitter have an anti-conservative bias, and Congress even held hearings to sort of hold these, Sheryl Sandberg was there and Jack Dorsey was there to sort of hold their feet to the fire to, against these charges of anti-conservative bias. I don't know if there's anti-conservative bias or not. I do know that by being completely untransparent around, the political ad buying process, they're basically inviting these charges.
Right.
So, for example, in the wake of 2016, one of the changes that all of these tech firms made in some iteration was to identify speech that is political or not. And if speech is political, then it has to be by verified actors. And so this is everything from Facebook sending literal postcards to the offices of digital consulting firms and of campaigns to verify that the people using Facebook for political ad buys are
Right.
U.S. citizens.
And it's not just political campaigns. I had to sign up and be verified because of some of the articles that I promote for White Hat online. So
Right. So that exactly speaks to the point, though, of like what is political and what is not political. About a month and a half ago, my colleague Daniel Crease and I were invited to the office of a Republican digital consultancy, and they were showing us these ads that had been rejected by these different platforms as being political or violating some of their standards. Some of the ads that were rejected for being political were not political, right? So it's totally unclear how these different platforms actually define what is political and what isn't. And then when you would have to be this verified user or not. And the process around that, I think, needs to be more transparent. The process around how political speech is regulated, what is and is not allowed on these different platforms. The Alex Jones case is the one that gets the most attention.
Right.
It's a good case study to look at, but we're hearing from people, and we see, if you follow any news organizations on Twitter, they're saying like, hey, we tried to put up this ad to get people to tell us if they're like excited about the political race in our city or state or not, and it was rejected for being political, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we need a lot more transparency from these different tech firms around what is political speech and what political speech is and is not allowed on these, on their various platforms. And until we get that, we're going to continue to see these charges of anti-conservative bias because there isn't any transparency around how these decisions are made.
Right.
And when these tech firms are all located in Silicon Valley, and I think it could be argued probably mostly are made up of a social and geographically liberal body of people, those charges then, without transparency around what happens, are going to take hold.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question about this transparency. Do you think that part of the reason that there isn't much transparency is because it's a moving target and they don't understand what they're looking for themselves right now, especially with, they've got pressure coming from Congress. They have these issues of foreign actors trying to manipulate their platforms, and they don't, not to mention just regular citizens trying to use it. And maybe could it be that they just don't know or they haven't figured it out themselves yet?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's an excuse
right, I agree.
for being bad at laying out clear definitions and around what different types of speech are or not permitted, and transparency around what that process looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So just following up on that idea of in the 2016 campaign, you mentioned how the Trump campaign took advantage of these embeds and the Clinton campaign didn't. One thing that I was wondering as I was reading this paper was also like, what did that look like on races for the House of Representatives, for the Senate? Were there similar things happening? Because that's where I really feel like a huge difference could potentially be made. I mean, if there's a swing state election that's within a percentage point or two or something, and somebody has access to this kind of this sort of subsidy, this sort of access to someone who's really good at crafting digital messages and campaigns, I feel like that could be an area where it could be really powerful. Like, did we see any of this in 2016, and will we see it in moving forward?
As far as I know, it doesn't appear that the tech firms had folks embedded at state level campaigns. It was explained to us as basically like, well, if you spend enough money, of course you'll get this level of service. And just frankly, even the most hotly contested state level races are not spending anywhere near the amount of money that a presidential campaign is, especially in the general. So no, I'm not aware that there were embeds, but there are these, working relationships between Republicans at Facebook and Google and Twitter with Republican campaigns, and then the Democratic teams at those firms with Democratic campaigns. Depending on how big the team is and how much money they're spending, they may not have like a one-on-one. They probably don't have a dedicated rep that works only for them, but they have a rep who works with them and a couple other campaigns. And this is just the stuff we know from talking to campaigns. Of course, especially at the state level, a lot of this campaign work is routed through digital consultancies that are paid for by super PACs that may support the candidate. It is much harder for us then to figure out more about the working relationship in those cases because there's not the same level of disclosure that's required. So, for example, we would have a harder time figuring out exactly who to contact, right? To try and talk, to try and interview people to figure out what's going on in these state level races. But from what I know from our ongoing work, like for sure, there are people at Facebook and Google and Twitter, working with state level races, Senate races, probably some of the hotly contested, bigger spending, congressional races as well. But as far as I know, it's not at the in-house level. It's just if you're a Republican candidate, you're working with the GOP team, inside one of these firms, or vice versa.
So I'd love for you to explain these digital consultancies a little bit more, because I have a feeling that people probably don't realize the ecosystem that is around a political campaign and all the firms that spring up to end up consulting with or supporting campaigns on different sides of the aisle. So I'd love to hear what you have learned about these digital consultancies.
Sure. And I'll say almost everything I've learned is a result of the work of my fabulous co-author, Daniel Kreis, who's literally written books on how these digital consultancy firms form. So basically what his research has shown is that, within a particular campaign, so like Obama '08, a lot of people come in, they're working literally inside the campaign. When the campaign's over, then they go out into the private sector and form digital consultancies, which then come in, in the midterm cycle or in the 2012 cycle and work for the campaign, but not as individual people, but through their digital consultancies. And so these digital consultancy firms are, for the most part, dedicated to politics, right? Sometimes they're dabbling in other things, but are for the most part dedicated to politics. And they're absolutely partisan. Just like polling has ended up being quite partisan, so too have these digital consultancy firms. So there's Republican or conservative firms, and then there's Democratic or liberal firms who work with candidates and campaigns, around those issues. And they may work with campaigns and candidates and also with issue movements or nonprofits that may be affiliated with either liberal or conservative causes.
So basically, these people get their start in a campaign, volunteering, working within the campaign itself. The campaign ends, and they go out, they start their own companies, and kind of use that experience in that first campaign to kind of bank on that and bring in clients. And that could be anybody across on their side of the political spectrum, but anybody across the board.
Absolutely, yeah.
This here is kind of taking it back sort of just to I think kind of the bigger picture of your research in a way. One of the things that you noted was that many studies that are doing similar things concerning trying to understand public opinion aren't really considering the role of tech firms as shapers of public opinion enough. And so I'm curious, what are the biggest dangers to having that sort of blind spot? If people aren't considering the roles of tech firms, what are they missing?
So I think they're missing a couple things in a couple different ways. So I guess from one part, there's sort of, it's the hot new thing in social sciences to pull a bunch of tweets off, an API and say like, oh, this is what people are thinking. I don't think that doesn't tell us what a certain group of people is thinking. I do think that information is important. And I'll talk in a minute about how I think not you, but anyone can best make use of that information. But what we're not seeing also is like that those things don't happen in a vacuum, that what happens on social media isn't just people sitting around, not influenced by anything in the whole world and just talking about politics. It's shaped by these tech firms and it's shaped by campaigns. In my dissertation, which I'm turning into a book proposal and a book now, I looked at how social media was used as a form of public opinion and to understand public opinion by both campaigns and by journalists. Journalists use social media as public opinion all the time, right? These stories like Trump tweets about the taco bowl, and here's what Latino Twitter thinks of
Yeah.
it. And then there's like 11 tweets, and this
Right.
is what Latino Twitter thinks, right?
Right.
And these are presented mostly as sort of unadulterated public opinion. But what I found out from talking to campaigns is, of course, that they work very hard to shape what public opinion looks like on social media. Everything from, the people in the Trump campaign told me they had this Trump Bigley team. And this was the people that they had identified as being like hardcore social influencers. So having, a certain number of followers and things like that, that if they wanted something to go viral, they would say, hey, we want this to go viral. Or, the Bernie Sanders campaign did something similar. They had a very active Reddit page as well where they could go and say, hey, people are talking about this, but let's bring it back to, free college tuition or whatever. Go change the conversation. And they did, right?
Wow,
And then
yeah.
we saw some of the conversations change. And those things end up then in press accounts of what's happening in a campaign. And these posts on social media are used to justify things like momentum, right? This sort of word that we hear from the press a lot in campaigns, that there's more momentum because 50,000 more people followed Bernie Sanders after the debate last night, and only 30,000 new people followed Hillary Clinton. So this explains this mysterious thing like momentum, right? But of course, that's shaped by campaigns, obviously, themselves.
That is fascinating because I watched some of that happen in the Bernie Sanders Reddit during the campaign. I would not have guessed at the time that it was the campaign saying, hey, go in and change that. So that's fascinating.
Right. And then I was going to speak to this idea. I think it made it sound like I was sort of shatting all over social media studies. I'm not. I do them myself. But when we, as social scientists or even journalists, anybody analyzing social media to try and understand public opinion, I think there is a lot we can understand from that. But we need to think about public opinion differently. So for the most part, when we think about public opinion, we think about surveys, which are private, individual, anonymized expressions. And so we know a lot about, what shapes those and what forces might act to make somebody answer one way or another way. We don't know a lot yet about what makes somebody say something or not on social media. What I argue in this dissertation, which will be a book, is that we have to understand social media as public opinion as something that is inherently public. It is stated publicly to enforce some audience, that the person writing it or acting imagines. And so it's relational. It's not individual like public opinion based on surveys is. It's relational. And that it's incredibly temporally sensitive. Almost every political expression or action on social media is reactive. And we can pinpoint down to the moment maybe what it may be a reaction to, but it may not last a long time, right? That sentiment within a particular person who decided to tweet like, I'm so angry about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, and women shouldn't be treated this way. Does that opinion hold for them 3 weeks from now when the news cycle has moved on? I'm not sure that we could meaningfully infer that it did, because I think it is very temporally sensitive as well.
And kind of following up on that, so you mentioned some of the challenges of using social media as a source of public opinion, and another challenge that I think that's pretty clear comes in trying sorting the massive amount of information that you have. And so one of my favorite news articles in recent months was that 538 news article that released a data set with 3 million Russian troll tweets. And so while they obviously don't represent American public opinion, I think it's clear that they serve as a valuable archive of how foreign actors might be attempting to influence and shape public opinion. And I'm wondering if you think there's anything else, like what other things can trolls or bots tell us? Is there something else to be found in information like that?
To me, one of the most interesting things that we might be able to learn from this bot activity, right, Russian interference and bot activity during the 2016 campaigns is how Americans reacted to it, right? So we can look at the content of their social media posts, and we can, scholars are getting a pretty good idea of what they were trying to do, which is mostly sow discord, right, in the American public. And maybe the most issue targeted thing was very pro-gun, right, in terms of taking a particular stance, while the rest was really just to sow discord. What we might learn about ourselves and about the American public through that is who reacted to that, right? Who was targeted by those particular posts? Who joined those groups? Who joined this Blacktivist Facebook group, and how did they engage with that? What can that tell us about not only what people may feel about issues like Black Lives Matter in this country, but also the level of sort of political digital literacy, right, that folks have to understand whether or not that was genuine. I think we can also see it with there's in some of these accounts that were identified to be associated with the Russian interference are one of them, what's fascinating ones to me, is this host of what appear to be local news outlets on Twitter, and they have names like the Cincinnati Newsroom, and they've been around since like 2013 or 2014, just tweeting kind of regular boring stuff about Cincinnati or whatever, and then they were activated right during the 2016 campaigns. And so, building trust for years in followers. These are not insignificant accounts. Some of them have tens of thousands of followers on Twitter. That's a lot, probably not all of those are genuine American followers, but still, that's going to get amplified by the way the Twitter algorithm works, in terms of having that many followers. So I think we can learn something about the American public in terms of how they engage and interact with that. And that's honestly the work I'd push to see more of, right? Is yes, the Russians interfered. We know this, right? I'm more interested in how we reacted to it. It seems to, at this point, at least, from what we see from the press, I would argue to be a pretty shrill and hyperactive overreaction to it, right? In terms of what impact it may or may not have had on the election. But I'd be much more interested to know how individual Americans reacted to and interacted with these social media posts. And that data exists, and I'd love to see it go beyond just the counting of how many followers, right? And sort of try and trace what that looked like.
Right.
That's fascinating. I love that. So another thing that comes up in your dissertation is this idea of elites having more control over the substance of political opinion. And again, as you said, not just journalists, but also sort of political elites using it to their advantage. One of the things I really appreciated in it was you had this example of Trump retweeting someone who was gushing about how great of a person he was, and it was so cool to just kind of see just on a personal level to see a Twitter screenshot in a dissertation. It's just the most beautiful moment for me. But it is a deeply serious thing, right? Especially since the 2016 election, throughout this administration, I think there's been a huge distancing from polling in some respects, as the president seems to share polls if they say something positive about his administration, and then anytime it says something negative, he kind of casts doubt on it and says that maybe it's not coming from a legitimate place. And I've even seen this locally with, we have a website here in Utah called utahpolicy.com, and every time they post any kind of public opinion poll, there's always comments I see of people saying things like, well, I wasn't polled, so how do you know this is what people think? And so I'm just curious, what do you make of this moment in terms, especially for journalism or academic work that tries to be data-driven? What kind of shift is taking place here?
I think there's a couple different things going on. I have a colleague, Dr. Bentoff. He's at the University of Minnesota, and he has a paper called The Nate Silver Effect. And I had people, the journalists I interviewed for my dissertation, say almost exactly the same thing to me. So these are two independent, accounts going on. After the 2012 election, when Nate Silver was still it didn't have 538 yet, but got it more right than the on the ground reporters who were talking about things like momentum and yard signs, and it was in fact all this aggregate polling that better predicted the outcome of the election. Then editors across the country said, yes, I want that. Give me data and poll aggregation. The fact is that's of course quite sophisticated, right? And most people don't do it particularly well or interpret it particularly well. Gets even more muddy if we're talking about social media data, right? What can be reasonably inferred? I would even argue that the people that are the most sophisticated at still don't always do it right. At 538 during the 2016 primaries, they had this big feature, it's still up, called the Facebook primary. Mm-hmm. And they got data from Facebook, and it mapped the ratio of likes to a particular candidate's page vis-a-vis the other candidates. So you could see who had the greatest share share of likes in any given, I think it was at the county level. Now they're 538. So first of all, they got access to Facebook data, which a lot of people didn't. But they're also, the folks, I'm friends with them, right? Like they're really great, and they're super smart. And they had this really important like methodological disclosure in the second paragraph, like this is just Facebook likes. This can't tell us anything about the election outcome. And it was really important and way better than any other news outlet did with sort of methodological disclosure. On the other hand, it's a choropleth map of the U.S. at the county level, which looks a lot like an electoral returns map, right? So despite their very careful, wording, to the casual viewer looking at it, it still communicated this idea that it was about politics and about votes and about polling. And so, I'm not unsympathetic towards newsrooms. It is hard as more and more of this data becomes available to them. How do we use it best, and how can we represent it best? I also am so intrigued by this idea of what you said. So this is the sort of last thing that my committee said. Stop. You're doing too much. You can't do this for your dissertation, but it'll be in the book. Is I'm really interested in the difference between social media as a representation of public opinion and survey data as a representation of public opinion in how the public interprets it, right? Yeah. So you bringing up these comments about like, well, no one's ever polled me, so these are garbage. This is not an uncommon reaction, right, to polling. And it's true, right? Most of the American public has not been surveyed in any given survey. That's how inference works. But that's complicated, right? However, most people use Facebook, and most people have said something political or seen something political on Facebook. So my little bit of a hypothesis is that people may just subconsciously see themselves more in public opinion that's made up of social media data as compared to public opinion that's sort of made up of survey data, just because it's something that they literally interact with every day. I mean, you brought up earlier, you're right, like trust in all these social media companies is at an all-time low. On the other hand, no one stopped using it, right? So I don't in fact think it would actually influence people's sort of implicit assumptions about what this might mean. So that's the sort of last step that I'm going to be working on is a couple experiments looking at how, different representations of public opinion, social media database versus survey database impact people's actual perceptions of what public opinion is, and importantly, their trust in it as well.
That's super exciting. I can't wait for your book.
Yeah,
Thanks,
same.
Is there a title for it, or when might we expect to see that?
I think it'll be pretty close, depending on what they'll let me do, to the dissertation. I'm right now finishing up the proposal, and I have interest from a couple different publishers. So we'll see what happens after that. Yeah.
Well, when you publish it, we'll have to have you back on the show to
for
talk
sure.
about
Yes,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll be
That'll
gray
so
by
cool.
then. The academic cycle is slow, but
Well, best of luck with it.
thank you.
All right, so we're starting to wrap up. So we have just a couple more questions for you. One question I had when we were talking about Facebook is these stories that have come out about their role with Cambridge Analytica getting access to Facebook's data and then somehow using it to manipulate advertising. And then was Facebook actually working with Cambridge Analytica? So, what do you make of that whole situation?
I think the fact that Facebook had their API, the app API open just really to almost anyone for so long, which allowed the people who then sold data to Cambridge Analytica to access not only your profile if you signed up for this I think it was like a psychology quiz app, but like who hasn't done some of those things, especially 5 years ago on Facebook? Like I think I did. There was a thing where you could see if you were in the Cambridge Analytica data, and I was because I had a friend who had did it, who had done this, done this like psychology app. I think that's concerning, and I'm glad that they've closed that down, and I think it's good for us that they were held sort of accountable for that. Whether Cambridge Analytica even got any meaningful data and was able to make any real world impact on election campaigns, I would say there's little to no evidence of that. We know the political science literature tells us that persuading voters is incredibly hard to do. And, the folks who study this in academia, for the most part, think this idea of like psychographic profiles of people based on their Facebook behavior is garbage, right? That you can't actually meaningfully learn anything about that. However, it did seem like a secret sauce to people in politics at the time. I interviewed some folks from the Cruz campaign right after the primary ended, and Ted Cruz's primary campaign for the presidency in 2016. They had used Cambridge Analytica, and told the people that I spoke with that worked on the Cruz campaign told me they credited his win in Iowa to being able to fully use the sort of Cambridge Analytica model. They weren't able to afford it for the other states, and so they said, we don't know how well it worked, but we do think in this one state it worked. Now, I have other researchers who, in the time since then have talked to folks who worked with it and said, oh no, it was kind of garbage. We don't think it was anything. So, and again, that's just people's impression of it. So I think that most empirical science would point us to the fact that they were just kind of like snake oil salesmen who did a really good job. That's easy to do when you drop words like data and psychometric, right? And you have these. I'm looking at this picture of the former chief executive Alexander Nix, with all these charts and graphs, and most people have no idea what that is, but it looks really nice. Yeah. And it's very convincing. Anytime that you can put data and quantification behind things, there's a level of trust, right, that people buy into. And I think that's more what I think can say we know about Cambridge Analytica than really anything else, is that they were really good at selling a product.
Well, it's nice to have that voice of reason going into the elections, because I know that has been, from what I've seen online, it's been a source of maybe hysteria is not the right word, but it's had people super worried about their using Facebook and during an election campaign. So it's nice to have that voice of reason.
Yeah, and I'll insert what I hope is a little bit more voice of reason too. I research social media, so I obviously think it's important. However, in the wake of the election, and especially in the wake of my work with Daniel Kreis, we had a lot of people wanting to talk to us about, well, is this then how Facebook won the election for Trump? I don't think social media played a huge role in the election of Trump. I think it's a lot easier to blame social media than it is to think about things like white supremacy and sexism. Yeah. Right? And so social media makes a pretty easy scapegoat in terms of not wanting to confront those much harder things about ourselves as a society and as a country. So I do think it's really important. I do think it plays a really important and vital role in our democracy. And I think we should be concerned about what that looks like. But I don't think that there's a hypodermic needle from a Facebook post to someone's decision at the voting box.
Well, my last question for you today is just kind of wrapping up this idea of censorship in a new social media era. You said earlier that social media is kind of the new public square. It's where everybody's going to have these conversations, at least these public conversations. So in some sense, and this is something that the book Twitter and Tear Gas has talked about, that if the new censorship is not preventing the spread of information, it's about adding noise, adding filler to the good information that's out there, so that you can't tell the difference between good information and bad information. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. There is so much noise on social media, and while there are spaces where people are having, I won't say they're deliberative conversations, but they're having political discussions, right? And I think, the fact that we can see those, for the most part, is really good for social science. It's good for journalism. It's good for us and how we understand ourselves as an American public. I think it becomes to play an outsized role when we look at the way that social media is represented in the press. So not only just representations of public opinion, so saying like, oh, this is how you can tell what people think about the pipeline, and here's 10 tweets about it, but in also the reamplification of political actors' posts. I'm thinking Trump's tweets, right? How many actual American citizens follow Trump on Twitter and then see every tweet he posts? Not that many. How many watch Fox News? How many watch CNN? How many read the New York Times? How many read USA Today, where those tweets are republished and rebroadcast? And so we see, it take on this even greater role. All types of different social media posts around politics as they're sort of amplified through the press. that becomes problematic when we think about some of the noise, right? When we try and think about understanding the public. In the wake of the sort of the lists of the Russian Twitter accounts being released, some colleagues of mine at the University of Wisconsin showed that over 31 U.S. news outlets had published tweets or Facebook posts from Russian actors as representations of public opinion in the press. So it looked like, here's what people think about the debate last night or whatever, and over 31 times it was actually these Russian actors.
Wow. That's crazy.
Right. And this sort of new form of like Vox Pop or man on the street interview, right? Except when you're interviewing a man on a street, you know he's a man and you know you're on a street, right? And we don't have that same sort of verification level with people on social media. I don't have an answer for that, right? I don't think that journalists are like not verifying because they're lazy. I don't know how you would go about necessarily verifying someone is who they say they are, who they appear to be on social media. But it's clear to me that we need some way to do that, right? That the news and journalism needs some way to do that, because they certainly don't need anything else undermining their trust, right? So, I don't think there's an easy answer, but we've got to find a way that we can filter out this noise, because I think filtering out the noise is better than disregarding it, right? I do think that social media offers a window into public opinion that we don't get with surveys, right? It's qualitative, it's public, it's relational. I think that's great. We just have to know how to figure out, who's who and what matters and maybe what doesn't. And I don't have the answer to how to do that yet.
Well, just kind of a very last thing to wrap up. So you mentioned you have your book coming up pretty soon, but what direction are you taking your research in now? What's next for you?
I'm really interested in looking at, I guess I would say like two areas, and I'll be quick. One area is continuing to look at sort of the role of tech firms in politics. And so not only looking at how do they interact with political users, which builds off our previous work, but also looking at how they represent themselves. So I'm doing some work looking at things like Mark Zuckerberg's testimony and news releases on Facebook. How are they publicly envisioning themselves in democracy, and what might we be able to learn about their thinking through that? And then another line is really bringing together different data to understand things better. So I mentioned earlier the Trump tweets in the press. I'm working on a pretty big project where we're trying to see, which presidential tweets make it in the press, and then how are those covered, right? Like, what do they do in a news story? Because I do think that we may be in a different state of press-state relations. And while I hope that no future president uses Twitter quite the same way that Trump does, I don't think that the shutdown of more traditional channels between the White House and the press and Twitter being used as a means to communicate is going to change. I don't think that will change. So I think that we need to understand then, what does that press-state relationship look like when it's mediated through a private social media company?
Fascinating.
Excellent. Well, Dr. McGregor, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
If you enjoyed this episode of Dot Citizen, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can find us anywhere that podcasts are available: Google, Stitcher, iTunes, and so forth. And if you don't listen to a podcast on one of those platforms, you can also find us online at whitehatmag.com/podcasts. That's plural, podcast with an S. You can also follow us at .citizenpod on Twitter, and be sure to send us your reactions to podcasts as well as suggestions for future episodes.